Okay, I think we are good to go. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar of the series. That's part of the effort to bring the computational biomechanics community together to understand our collective needs, our challenges, and hopefully through these exercises we can create a roadmap to build an open source ecosystem that benefits us all. And this is funded by the NSF Pose Award, and we are very excited to have these conversations and hear from you all. So please feel free to reach out to us if you want to share your work and think that the community can help or benefit from what you're doing. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the KneeHub team that for the past several years have dedicated their effort to understand reproducibility in knee modeling, and will be sharing with us their experiences. With that, I'm going to hand the control off to Jason Halloran and Imhauser, who are two of the 5 leads on this project and will be leading today's webinar. And just to maintain the continuity, because we have several presenters today, if you have any questions during the presentations, please put them in the chat box, and we will be answering all the questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you. Jason, you should be able to share it now.
Starting. Does everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay, Carl, you can take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Imhauser. I'm here to talk about KneeHub, an evolving community-driven resource towards reproducible open source knee modeling and simulation. And I'm happy to present with to lead this discussion with Jason Halloran. Next slide, please. So just to begin, modeling and simulation of the knee joint has seen a tremendous increase in complexity and utilization over the last 4 decades. This has evolved from in-house custom models with dozens of elements to multi-scale, multi-physics simulations incorporating widely available open source and commercial packages, utilizing hundreds of thousands of elements. So next slide, please. So at the same time, the topic of reproducibility of scientific findings has rippled through the research community over the last decade. A key foundation of the scientific method is reproducibility of results, which, when achieved, provides a key component of the evidence necessary for clearly supporting a hypothesis, but ultimately for enacting change and filtering all the way down to things in medical practice, for example, or invention. And so, unfortunately, reproducibility has proven to be easier said than done. And as you might expect, this has garnered significant attention from national scientific funding agencies. And this important topic also applies to modeling and simulation. And so, next slide, please. Within this context, a multi-institutional collaboration has been developed and collectively known as KneeHub. And we've actively attempted to address the question of modeling and reproducibility of modeling and simulation under, in phase 1 of this effort, the primary following research question, which is, do the predictions of natural knee biomechanics depend on the modeling decisions of separate development teams when the target simulation scenarios and the source data to build the models are the same? And so to conduct this study over the last 5 years, we follow the following study phases. They include model development, model calibration, model benchmarking, and model reuse. And each of these phases was prospectively documented and is openly shared on the SimTK website. So today, next slide, please. We're going to tell you a little bit about some of the findings from this previous effort, and also ask for your help and the help of the knee modeling and simulation community to maximize the impact of ongoing efforts and future work. And so under this context, we've several speakers that are going to present some of our previous work, as well as some of our work and efforts, and outline some of the work going forward. So from we have Thor Andreassen. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Mayo Clinic. He's going to tell you about his work compiling the group's findings regarding model calibration. Next, we have Maryam Nazem, who's currently a master's student at the University of Denver, and she's going to discuss her efforts compiling all the team's work on model benchmarking. And then next, Kate Moyle and Nancy Kim, who are both PhD students at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute, are going to describe their experiences interacting with the KneeHub dataset as they embark on the next phase of this project. And finally, Jason Halloran, who's a scientist based at Washington State University, will further describe these next steps in the development of community-driven, consensus-based workflows. So we're really thrilled at the opportunity to give this presentation. We look forward to constructive feedback and having a really interactive and engaging discussion. So thank you, and please, I welcome Thor to speak next.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction, Carl. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, great. So like Carl said, I'm currently a postdoc at the Mayo Clinic, but during my PhD, I was one of the graduate students at the University of Denver that worked on a lot of this project. And I'm pretty excited to talk to you about the development and calibration phases of this project, which is sort of how the models get built and then you trained on. So right out of the gate, these knees next come from two publicly available data sets, the open knee data set and the natural knee data set. And within each of these, there's a combination of imaging data that's used to develop the models, as well as experimental dynamics testing that's used to calibrate and benchmark the models against. And so next, so as you can see here, here's some of the developed knees or models from one of the two knees. And if you look at it, you'll notice that in general, they all look pretty similar, which makes sense given that they're the same input data. But there were noticeable differences in how teams decided to create these models and then calibrate them. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that while the original input data is the same, teams are given free discretion to go forward and develop and calibrate them however they so choose. So if you go to the next slide, we'll investigate some of the actual differences. So right out of the gate, there were differences in the actual geometries of the final model. So even for, let's say, the same structures across all the models, the bones, the cartilage, and the cruciate ligaments, we observed that there were differences in the actual geometries themselves. So there were differences in the surface distances of the bones, the thicknesses of the cartilage, and the attachment sites of the cruciate ligaments. So those were one of the big differences we observed in the actual development phase of this project. If you go to the next slide, the other major difference we observed, and I want to keep in mind that there's a lot of differences. So in an hour-long talk, we'd need to make 100 of these presentations to get through probably a portion of it. So these are just some big ones. The other big difference is in the coordinate systems. So while every team decided to use Gruden-Sunte coordinate systems, these differed significantly with, as you can see here on the figure on the right, even just differences in the original offsets. But there were differences just from a more semantic standpoint in that some teams use clinical versus cylindrical Gruden-Sunte. There were differences between the left and right knee. There were differences in the original experimental data sets. There were differences in sign convention. And then there were even differences in sort of the naming convention. So while one team might choose to call something as distraction or compression, another team may refer to that same motion as superior, inferior. And so that led to a lot of issues down the road, because what this means is that by themselves, the results that these models report are not directly comparable because their coordinates aren't the same, and so they don't necessarily report results in the same way. So that's the development phase. If you go to the next slide, we'll dive into a little bit of the calibration phase. And so what calibration is it's taking the developed models and using the experimental data as a means to optimize the internal material properties of these models to try and match the experimental data. And so I want to highlight that the original experimental data sets are pretty massive. There's way too many flexion angles, loads, and degrees of freedom for people to optimize against everything. So instead, teams chose to use a subset of these points to calibrate against. And the reason this matters is that regardless of what optimization strategy teams used, these chosen targets are fundamentally what their model is effectively trying to match. So as an example, this representative figure on the right is one of the degrees of freedom from one of the knees. And on the x-axis, we have the knee angle. And on the y-axis, we have the applied varus valgus torque. And every one of these points represents some value from the original experimental data that the teams showed their model and tried to get it to match during that calibration. And there's a lot of differences, but two of the major ones we observed, if you click next for me, was that some teams tended to pick a few number of loads, but at a large number of flexion angles, while in contrast, if you click, teams did the opposite approach, where they picked a large number of loads, but at only a few angles. So that was kind of a big difference in what data people felt was important to show their model. So if you go to the next slide, there were also additional differences in the actual optimization done. And while there's way too much to talk about for this, I want to highlight one piece because it's a carryover from the development phase. So if you click next, for the teams that used three-dimensional ligament structures, it just so happened that they only optimized a limited number of material properties, in this case 4 each, but chose to calibrate their model against a large number of experimental targets. While in contrast, the teams that used one-dimensional ligament representations tended to optimize a very large number of material properties, but at a much smaller number of calibration targets. And so this is interesting and is pretty relevant to the topic here today about consensus building, because it demonstrates that decisions made during one phase can potentially implicate how teams will decide to do something for the next. So if you go to the next slide, so what are the key takeaways from this? Well, if you click next, on the development phase, coordinate systems is kind of the biggest one. So in particular, because it affects everything that comes after. And then on the calibration side, the targets are kind of the big one, because different teams felt different portions of the experimental data would likely have more impact on their model's ability to recreate these individual motions. And then lastly, and this is kind of a big one that sort of encompasses everything, which is that these are pretty experienced modeling teams that have existing pipelines to develop these models. And so overwhelmingly, teams decided to transform the experimental data to match their existing model strategy, rather than adapt their model strategy to match the original experimental data. And what that means in practice is there's a significant amount of post-processing done, both in the original, when teams take the data from online and transform it to match their protocol, but then after the fact to be able to compare between teams. There's post-processing to be able to compare across results. And this is one of the things we think is pretty important for building consensus workflows to make it easier to adapt these. And the last thing I want to highlight, and this is something that Nancy and Kate will talk a little bit more about, is as you saw in this video on the right, while there's way too much detail to get into for the overall strategies, every team is required to provide extensive details of how they built their models. And so beyond what's written here and in the papers, every team has written down every single step they did for every part of the phase. But with that, I want to pass it off to Maryam to talk about the benchmarking and how these decisions affect the model's ability to make predictions.
Thanks, Thor. Hello, everyone. This is Maryam. Thanks for being here today. I'm going to talk about the results of the model benchmarking phase and model reuse. Model benchmarking is a critical step in validation of a computational model beyond the condition it was calibrated for. In this context, it can be defined as the process of checking whether our computational models accurately capture the relative contribution of structural components like ligaments or cartilage. The goal of this phase was to assess the predictive ability of the model. Therefore, we compared the results with the experimental data, which were separated from the model development and calibration data. Model benchmarking is a strong way to test if the model is robust or not. We performed model benchmarking for 2 data sets, the natural knee and the open knee. For the natural knee, in which the ACL was removed, we examined passive flexion and 3 laxity tests for 2 flexion angles. Here we are going to focus on the laxity tests only. And for the open knee, we examined the combined loading conditions at 4 flexion angles. Next. Yeah. Here you can see the summary table for the root mean square errors. Errors for different evaluations are reported in 3 directions, and the primary degrees of freedom are highlighted in blue. Across all evaluations, the largest errors consistently appeared in an internal-external direction. Next slide, please. Since the AP translation is directly related to the role of the anterior cruciate ligament, we decided to highlight the AP laxity test results. Just a reminder, the DO2 did not have ACL. So these are the primary results for the AP laxity test at 2 flexion angles for all 5 groups and the experiment. You can see that there is an offset at the unloaded condition for each team, but as we want to only focus on the effect and results of the laxity loading and compare the stiffness and the range of translation, we will look at the results on the shifted plots in the next slide. In the shifted plots, we can see that the models were stiffer than reality, meaning for the same applied load, they predicted smaller translation. Also, results were consistent since for both angles and the different loading, we had the same behavior. You can see that different choices and methods have caused different stiffness for secondary elements. Next slide. Okay. As the goal of the model benchmarking was to apply challenging and clinically relevant loading, for the open knee, the pivot shift test was simulated. Relevant results at 4 flexion angles are reported for all groups and the experiment. Next. One group experienced numerical instability and one model could not reach the last flexion angle. Next, those results were not included in an error calculation. The largest errors were seen in IE direction 2, likely due to the larger range of rotational motion compared to the varus valgus direction. Next slide, please. Okay, to wrap up, I would like to highlight a few key takeaways. First, despite a strong commitment to reproducibility, converting data to a common coordinate system was challenging, largely due to the differences in an anatomical coordinate system that we talked about in a previous phase, sign conversion, and the loading setups. For example, whether the femur or tibia is fixed, as you can see in this picture. In our field, it is common to take the calibrated model and apply new conditions, often more extreme ones like removing the ACL or simulating a pivot shift test, as the benchmarking pushed the models beyond their calibration condition. We would call it extrapolation. Naturally, in this phase, the errors were larger than the calibration phase, which is more like the interpolation. We also observed instability and convergence issues. To add more, these findings remind us that benchmarking is an essential step for uncovering hidden model limitations before using them, especially in the ones that have clinical applications where unpredictable behavior can have serious consequences. And this leads us into the main goal of the reuse phase. Next slide, please. The main goal of the reuse phase is to anticipate the reliability of the models that were developed before to simulate clinically relevant scenarios. Next, please. The difference between model reuse and the previous phase is that in the reuse phase, we compared the results across groups, and there is no experimental data here. In terms of progress, early results indicate that many of the differences observed in early phases have continued into this phase. To move forward, I would like to hand it over to our collaborators from the University of Auckland, Nancy and Kate. Thanks.
Thank you, Maryam, and hello, everyone. My name is Nancy, and me and my other colleague, Kate, are the PhD students from Auckland Bioengineering Institute. So today we will walk you through how to access the data, sharing our insights from my own experiences. So next slide. So when I first started my PhD, I was given the task of finding some benchmarking data from different groups on SimTK for just comparisons. So at this time, I wasn't really familiar with the project as different phases or even how to use the SimTK. So trying to navigate the platform without this knowledge was a bit overwhelming. So there were so many files and I wasn't really sure what I was really looking at. So what really helped me is this confusion was reading the papers released by the KneeHub groups. So if you're new to this project or want to understand it better, I highly recommend reading them. So these papers contain like key figures and results you've seen today. However, the benchmarking paper is still in progress. So on the next slide, if you're looking for like a really raw data or like outcomes or any documentations, everything is on SimTK. So, and really big thanks to Joey who walked through the SimTK from the last seminar. So our team has been using this data share that she talked about, and this feature will become more useful to our next phases. So I'll now walk you through some key aspects of accessing this information, which will be wiki and documents and source code tabs. So before diving into the data, I strongly recommend reading the wiki. So when I first started, I didn't really fully understand how the folders were structured, and I mistakenly collected experimental data instead of the predicted data for comparisons. So the wiki provides a comprehensive overview covering the project structure, data resources, and a detailed outline of each phases. So on the next slide, so this is what you can see when you scroll down the wiki. So you'll find descriptions of each phase along with hyperlinks that lead to more detailed explanations. So these pages outline expected outcomes and serve as a helpful guide for retrieving the information of the data that you need. So for accessing specific documentations and outputs, I'll now hand over to Kate.
Thanks, Nancy. So after you've read through the key papers Nancy mentioned earlier, describing the overall project, I'd recommend coming to the documents page on SimTK, as you can see on this slide. Here you can find each team's initial modelling workflows and specifications across the model development, model calibration, and model benchmarking phases. There is a click down section for each team containing 12 documents each. It can be initially a bit intimidating seeing these 12 documents, all with slightly varied naming conventions, so I'll break these down for you. There are 6 documents for each knee model, with the knee models being made from the natural knee dataset and the open knee dataset, both abbreviated to NKD and OKS here. Each model has 2 documents for each of the 3 project phases. However, these 2 documents for each phase are the same documents in different formats. So for simplicity, I like to just use the PDF. A few things to note are the naming conventions for each knee specimen, as I just briefly mentioned. I've documented these here in case there is any confusion. And additionally, bear in mind that any deviations from these initial protocols were documented, but not displayed in this section. So beware, some things may have changed from these documents. These deviations can be found in the SimTK source code section, but I'll show you that on the next slide. So here's the source code section. Once you feel like you've had a good grasp on the project and want to play around with some data or our models or create your own, I recommend coming to the source code. Source code contains everything used in the project, so will most likely end up being your sole place you'll come to find everything. After you've wrapped your head around the model specifications section, after navigating to the browse source code in SimTK, you will see the folders are split into the 3 project phases. Today I'll talk you through the model benchmarking folder structure, but each phase follows a similar structure. Within each phase folder, you'll see 3 folders. These include the data folder, which has the imaging data and experimental joint mechanics from both knee specimens used in the modelling workflows. Secondly, you'll see the specifications folder, which has the exact same model specifications that you found in the previous slide on the documents folder. Hence why I mentioned the source code section can become the sole project tool once you're familiar with the project, eventually making the SimTK documents almost redundant for you. And lastly, the outcomes folder, which contains all final and intermediate outcomes along the modelling journey, including segmentations, meshes, and models with different loading conditions applied for their various project phases. And you'll also find supporting code there. Finally, within this folder, you'll see the model deviations mentioned earlier. These are super useful because you can see how each team fixed any issues they encountered. And just to note, these mistakes have been made already and documented, so you don't have to have the same struggles as the rest of the KneeHub team did during each project phase. Next slide, please. Since joining the KneeHub group, I've worked on getting the ABI model that was created back in 2020 up and running. This has proven to be quite a struggle with the software version updates that have happened in FEBio over the last 5 years. As I've discovered during this process, the software and software versions we create our models in underpins all of our modeling decisions. Pretty significant features can change in certain software over version upgrades, resulting in the need to change model features. And from my experience, these changes can have a huge impact on the model itself, right down to the ligament material properties used in my case with FEBio. Below, if of any interest to anyone, I have listed a few of these major features that had to be changed to account for the software version updates. However, in saying all of this, the comprehensive documentation and deliverables from each team at all the phases of the project have allowed for the ongoing use of the models. Overall, this awesome resource allows for modelers to follow tried and tested workflows, make deviations from these workflows, and cherry pick the best model features, further improving our knee models and allowing the modeling community to move forward as a whole, rather than starting from scratch every time you begin modeling. Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Jason.
Great, thanks, Kate and Nancy and everyone else for getting us this far and going over the previous phase, if you will, or original KneeHub work. I'm going to talk about developing our consensus workflows, which is essentially the renewal of this grant and where we introduce the ask of you folks. So a kind of the overall driving questions in this renewal is first, how to improve credibility. We feel this is particularly relevant for translation. We want to help establish guidelines and best practices in modeling and simulation. Of course, as evidenced by this webinar, we want to develop community. It's somewhat active already with a fair number of downloads across the world. And then finally, the real driving question in the work itself is, do consistent workflows equal consistent predictions? As you've seen, all of our workflows we chose ourselves across the groups, and those led to some pretty significant variability in our predictions. So now our new intent, or our new focus, is similar to the last time, except now I've underlined an update here. We are going to adopt the same data with the same intent, but now we're going to try to achieve consensus-based workflows. So how are we going to achieve this consensus? We've chosen to adopt a Delphi-based approach, which essentially, think of it as an anonymous collective opinion of a panel, folks like yourselves. But before that, we need to first prioritize our context of use, also using feedback from you folks. This is the high-level overview of the project. I'm going to get into the specifics of how we're starting here in 1 second. So after we develop our context of use, or we all decide on these, we're going to perform Delphi so that we can decide on the modeling processes to take. So essentially, each step in the modeling process, creation of anatomy, model development steps, loading and boundary conditions, calibration if applicable, all these things we talked about, we're going to decide and document how to do these steps. This, of course, is also inclusive of the credibility activities, so establishing believability in your models. So that was aim 1. In aim 2, we're actually going to test the reproducibility of these workflows, and the KneeHub team will do that in various forms. And the idea is that we're going to test and determine the sources of irreproducibility using statistical evaluation. So on the right is our sort of flow chart of what goes on here. We're going to have two contexts of use to tackle. And then we're going to evaluate how well and how consistent or how reproducible these workflows are that are related to each of these contexts of use. Of course, we're going to disseminate all the results and documentation of this process, including the Delphi process. Okay, so a little bit from a more practical perspective on how this is going to proceed. We have, again, 2 contexts of use. In the interest of maintaining progress, the first context of use and workflow we've decided to pursue within the KneeHub team itself. So we're getting consensus across our 5 teams, both in a context of use and for the modeling workflows. So again, the practical implications of this decision are that we get to progress in parallel with the Delphi process, where we're going to interface with you folks. I think it's also been very valuable for us to establish the workflow needs for the Delphi process that I'll outline shortly. But our first context of use, so you're aware, the relevance of it is that it's a subject-specific pre-injury, post-injury, and reconstructed ACL mechanics. And the modeling and simulation goals are pinpointing the limits of unified modeling and simulation capabilities in a data-rich setting. So that's an important piece. We've adopted a data set, experimental data set from Carl Imhauser at HSS. That's ACL, that's from an ACL specific study that is being disseminated now. Yeah, we've chosen to take this path so that we can also streamline the Delphi process. So how this is going to proceed, and some of you are certainly going to be involved. The first step is for us to recruit our experts. And I've bolded some words here that are relevant that I'm going to discuss a little bit more detail in the next slides, but we're going to recruit experts from specific quote unquote activity areas. And we're going to assess the experts' involvement using qualification criteria. So what we're doing here is trying to formalize and document and be very transparent about how and who is involved in this expert panel. Now, once we have that expert panel, the second step is to participate in our Delphi process or Delphi studies. And we're specifically calling these studies. And these studies progress from broad to specific. So I'm going to go into detail here briefly on the first step, which is the recruitment of our experts. And our experts will be made up, again, in these activity areas. I've listed them here, things like these individuals might perform knee biomechanics research, computational extremity joint biomechanics research. We've also included an area that might be representative of clinicians, knee or extremity joint focused musculoskeletal care, and then down to science of reproducibility and regulatory science and extremity and joint medical devices. So we have our activity areas, and how do we qualify individuals in one or more of these areas? What we've come up with is these individuals have to have 3 research publications as an author or patents as inventors, or be key personnel in a funded project, or have professional experience and expertise in one specific area for at least 5 years. So this is how we'll qualify our experts in each of these areas. Now, each of these activity areas is going to define inclusion into a specific study or studies. And these specific studies, again, are where we're going to perform our Delphi. Each of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are going to have their own individual Delphi process. And we start from very broad in terms of determining the context of use. And then we move to the second step, determining the broad simulation study design. So how or what are we going to model? Not the how are we going to model, but what needs to be there, down to more specifics. How do we develop the model? How do we define anatomy? How do we perform calibration? Now, very importantly, each of these studies is going to be an iterative survey of yes or no answers using an online service. So, and again, it'll be anonymized so that the interactions are relatively efficient and we won't know which answers are tied to which individuals. The goal is, and we've gone back and forth on this number, right now is greater than 70% agreement in each study. But I think the real sort of benefit of this is that this staged approach hopefully eases the burden of participation. Admittedly, also eases the burden of us processing the data. It's taken a lot of work up front, but I think it's worth it for this to make this a streamlined process. Okay, so we're trying to be efficient today, so we have a lot of time. I'm going to get right into the key takeaways and acknowledgements. Hopefully you have a good idea of the overview of what we've done and our next steps. The 2 kind of primary takeaways are that KneeHub is an active and evolving resource for the computational, I would say in general, computational biomechanics community. And we also ask for your participation in our Delphi process so that we can determine a consensus-based knee modeling workflow based on the context of use that we come up with for the second one as a community. I'll also leave us with some questions for the audience, hopefully to help inspire some conversation. So the first is, what are the benefits and barriers for your participation in this Delphi? Second would be, do you have any concerns or recommendations about our approach? And finally, what resources would help most in your own work? Things like the data, access to the workflows, training material, example models. We could list, that list could go on and on, of course. But of course, you're more than welcome to answer or ask any questions that would be of interest that you have been inspired by our talk here today. As a reminder, these are the 5 labs that are involved. You've seen talks from individuals that are actually doing the work in most instances, and the list is much bigger than us, and we thank everyone for their time and contributions. Maybe I'll leave the questions up for now so you can see those and open up the floor. So again, we're tried to make this relatively efficient so we could have time to talk and get your guys' feedback. So that's it. Matter Snail, do you want to MC the?
Yeah, certainly. If they have a question, they can raise their hands and we can call them out so that they can show their face and ask their question, like, in person, and introduce themselves as well. But also, if you want to type it in the chat box, like for the record, that's fine. Nico, I see you have a question. Do you want to?
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. So greetings from Holland. But I enjoy this very much. I think this is the way to go. And yeah, and of course, it's astonishing how different the models' outcomes are, and we really need to do something about it. And I think the Delphi approach is really very logical. And I was wondering how far you are, because it seems now as if you still have to start with it, but how far are you now in the process?
We're currently getting, and anyone else, anyone chime in, getting IRB approval for our process. So immediately after that, we're going to start recruiting. So we needed to get the IRB approval so we could perform the study. What we found is it's to be this thorough, it's a lot more involved than we originally envisioned. The practical side of it is it's 100% more work than I originally thought.
Okay.
So
yes.
yeah, we anticipated the first year starting this, and now we're in year 2, and we haven't sent out and got our expert panel yet, but I think that's to be expected in hindsight.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And
Thanks.
I think just to add on that, like, we really underappreciated what it takes to do a good Delphi study.
Mhm.
And once we started like digging deep, I think we have a good plan now, and I think we really want, ask, anybody's opinion about that too, and anybody's contribution, because we want to do it right, because we will not have many opportunities to be able to do these kind of studies.
Yeah, and like for instance, we hadn't even, when we were awarded the renewal, hadn't even detailed how we were going to recruit the experts and how we're going to qualify them. And we realized, in the interest of reproducibility and transparency, we should document this and come up with an approach that we can justify to everyone and ourselves.
Mark, you seem to have a question. Mark Horner, do you want to ask in person? If not, I can read it
Fine
too.
putting it in the chat. But yeah, I guess what I saw was a lot of deterministic simulation, and at least for validation, more and more we're seeing that uncertainty is a critical element of not only understanding, what are the key parameters in the system, but what's the confidence level in the prediction that we're making. So I'm not sure if I saw or if you plan to incorporate uncertainty into the workflows that you're generating.
Maybe I'll take the first stab. I don't want to answer all the questions, but it's going to depend on the context of use, right? And what we come up with in terms, at least in terms of the renewal, with what credibility activities that the community deems are important. And that could absolutely and certainly be a part of it. I think in the first phase or the first part of KneeHub, we were mostly trying to get our workflows executed, and they did end up being mostly deterministic. But we weren't as focused as we are now. And I absolutely think some of these credibility activities in this renewal will include some form of uncertainty.
And maybe I will ask that question to Maryam, Kate, Nancy, and Thor. Like, did they see any signs of where we need to do uncertainty when you go through the calibration and benchmarking data?
Yeah, I guess I can throw myself in front of that train. So I will say that one of the things I observed, at least in the calibration phase, was that the points people chose to calibrate their model, they gave descriptions of exactly why, but there isn't enough evidence to suggest why a certain point might be better or worse for that calibration process. And I'd be willing to bet money that if there was uncertainty, particularly in the points that people chose to use, that would dramatically steer their model away from certain correct predictions, right? So it's probably one of those things where I noticed, like, one of the things a long time ago that we observed that I didn't highlight, but the Auckland group was the only team that sort of took the original experimental data and then fit a surface to it. Which we felt probably removed some of the uncertainty in the original measurements and then sampled from that to create their targets. So that's potentially a strategy that might avoid some of this, but I certainly think that the uncertainty of these models is potentially pretty significant, and it is emphasized on what exactly people thought matters is probably going to dramatically differ in how variable they are to some of those input uncertainties, if you will.
Thanks, Thor. And I think Nick Fiorentino raised his hand first, and then I will follow his his question with Nolan's question in chat. Nick, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, well, thank you all for this. It's good to hear from everyone, especially people doing the hands-on work. I appreciate these questions at the end too, especially that last one. I think I talked to Ahmet about training materials. I think that would be super helpful for me as I have new students start in my lab to kind of have them start with those materials. But my question is really more about kind of maybe the different uses of knee biomechanics models. I've talked to Matt and Carl about this a little bit. You know, some of us who do FE work might not be focused as much on predicting correct joint angles that were provided by Carl's robot. For us that maybe are doing a different type of modeling, would maybe this not be the best approach, or are there other kind of ways that we could kind of harness this framework for maybe predicting contact stress, for example? Is that something you all have probably thought about, Jason especially?
Yes, it again goes back to the context of use, but depending, absolutely. And actually in the reuse phase, we will be comparing, which we haven't fully compiled yet, some contact mechanics between the teams. But absolutely, if the says that that's one of the metrics that is important to the model performance, absolutely be looking at stuff like that. And I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts on this too.
Nolan, do you want to ask your question that you typed in the chat box? And say hi. If not, I can actually.
Mic isn't working.
Your mic isn't working. I will ask the question then. So there appears to be a large variability in determining the anatomic coordinate systems. How much of this could be due to different approaches, and how much due to variability in joint geometry? And maybe I should actually direct this question to Nico Verdonschot, who did a Delphi study on coordinate systems, right, Nico?
It is clear that people use different landmarks, different methods of determining the coordinate systems. When I saw the figure with the different coordinate systems, that is how it is. So I think even when we have exactly the same bone geometry, some people use one cylinder for the condyles, others use fitted spheres. Some people use two different cylinders to fit through the condyles. So those things all make a difference. Also on the tibia plateau to calculate the center. So I think it would be great if we have a bit more consensus on that. We tried to do also a Delphi study on that, which is now accepted for publication, and some of you were involved in that. Thank you for that. But it doesn't mean that let's say the simulation community adapts that. So it would be great if maybe from a society point of view, like the ISB or the ESB, or somehow we adopt certain choices and everybody does the same. So somehow, I think it would be great. And you're working towards that. So that's why it's so important what you do.
Michael Rainbow, you seem to raise your hand.
Hello, good to see you all. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. First of all, this is really fantastic. I'm really excited about it. I guess I had a follow-on question, and I don't want to trivialize the coordinate systems because I think it's really hard and tricky, but I guess if everybody published their bone meshes and kinematic transforms, I guess my question is, there's like deep model differences, and then there's differences you could correct. So like 15 models could all be doing the same thing, but have different coordinate systems, but that could probably be fixed. So I guess one question is, the results you showed, were they all in everybody's individual coordinate systems, or were those transformed? And like, is that maybe a potential best practices kind of, maybe I'm getting ahead of the thing, but like, encouraging people to kind of publish their data so you can actually recreate the results. And I think that could be important, because I could see choosing different coordinate systems for scientific reasons, like wanting to use a specific system to answer a specific question. So I'm not sure if everyone's ever going to agree to use the same system, I guess. All right, sorry, I'll stop.
I saw Tor A's mic go off. He has a lot to say about this.
Yeah, so I'll say that, like, to say that combining the coordinate systems is a nightmare would be making it sort of an understatement. And I want to highlight that the coordinate systems, there's effectively two problems. So that figure, that was after teams developed models and said, here's the experimental data and how the coordinate systems got created. Let's try and put those coordinate systems on based on how they were described in the experiment. And then in that work, they used ICP, and it illuminated that, just to Nico's point, the actual coordinate systems got created on the bones differently. So we went back to the drawing board, and every team was basically, the teams that provided the data sets gave a much more detailed description of how they built those coordinate systems, and teams then redid that process. And so we believe that got rid of the coordinate system differences that were sort of applied on the bones. But what overwhelmingly carried through, though, was which coordinate systems got created on the bones. Then it came to the conventions of, well, as a quick example, Amit uses cylindrical Grudensente versus the University of Denver uses absolute, right? So the original data sets don't have the same coordinate systems, and how our models are fundamentally running those joint motions and reporting the results aren't the same. And so, to your point, one of the things that effectively became the only way to compare was, I went through everyone's reported kinematics, backed out what their original 4x4 transformations were, and then recalculated the kinematics. So overwhelmingly, and this is kind of one of the recommendations in the calibration paper, is that while it makes sense to report kinematics from the standpoint of like showing the results in a paper, they're almost useless when it comes to being able to reproduce people's results, because they are so dependent on those coordinate systems. So what you really need to do is, let's say, export the geometries of your bones in those coordinate systems, and for any results you want to be able people to reproduce, or the actual data sets, they really need those 4x4 transformations. Any sort of initial post-processing that the data sets had to try and make it easier, to be honest, just ended up making it harder. So I think, to your point, it's very apt that some of those differences could be consensus-based, but because there's so many different possible coordinate systems that could have been created, it ends up being easier to sort of just output it as, here's all of it in its raw form, and whoever comes along next can change it to match more of what they're used to dealing with, or what their clinicians are used to understanding, if you will, is sort of my experience.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other final comments? And does anybody in the audience want to present in one of those sessions, by the way? Like, about the resources that they may want to share, or they may want to point out the challenges that they had. Maybe the community may solve it for them. So we are trying to make these. Go ahead, Snell.
Sorry, I would also like to bring up the last question here. Which resources do you think would be beneficial to your work? Because the purpose of these webinars is so we can really understand what the community needs are, and hopefully have ways to address them in our phase 2. So if you have very specific needs, data workflow, training material, etc., please let us know. So that way we can address those and have the infrastructure built to facilitate that.
Right.
All right.
Well, if nothing else, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you, Jason, Carl, Maryam, and Thor, Kate, Nancy, and really the hard work was done by Kate, Nancy, Maryam, and Thor. We were just trying to convey the message.
All right.
Thank
Great.
you
Thanks
all.
everyone for coming.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.